Hi, welcome back to this course on infrastructure finance. This is lecture number 36, and in this lecture we will talk about the context of infrastructure development. So far we have been talking about infrastructure finance, but then finance does not happen in a vacuum. It also depends on the context at which the infrastructure projects are being set up. So, we will actually kind of understand a little bit about the context in infrastructure development and essentially the conditions that actually encourage private sector investment. Before we actually do that, let us try and discuss questions that we had at the end of the previous lecture. We had two questions. Question number one was should equity investors also take a political risk insurance? Okay, so we will try and discuss this question in a broader perspective. Let us say, for example, there are two kinds of investors in a project, right. So, if you really look at a project, so there are debt investors and then there are equity investors. So, the question that we had is should we also have equity investors taking political risk insurance? But let us first try and understand how the insurance generally works. Let us take a very simple example. Let us say, for example, you are taking a housing loan, and when you take a housing loan, let us say from a bank, the bank would also require you to actually buy an insurance for the property. Okay. So, should there be any unforeseen circumstance, should there be any damage to the property, then the bank will actually claim the insurance, and the insurance claim will be first used to settle the outstanding loan from the bank, and then whatever is the balance, that will be used to pay the house owner. Let us say you have the house owner and then you have the bank. So, the house owner takes a house insurance policy . So, should there be any damage to the property, the proceeds of the policy will first go to the bank, right. It will first go to the bank, and then whatever is the residual after settling the loan from the bank, it will be going to the house owner. So, that is the way in which the insurance works. So, lenders get protection. Normally what happens is the bank also has house as a security, but then if the property is damaged, that no longer is a security for the bank. So, over and above the asset being the security, the bank would also need some kind of insurance protection. Okay. So, we can see this kinds of insurance protection in many of the asset categories like vehicle loan and so on. So, let us say, for example, if the housing owner repays a bank loan, then the bank releases the insurance policy, and then the insurance proceeds after that is assigned in favor of the house owner. But till the time the loan is in existence, the claims from the insurance policy will first go to the bank. Same is the case with infrastructure projects as well. So, when you talk about political risk, debt holders will demand political risk from the project. So, that means the equity owners will actually have to take political risk insurance, and they will have to pay for the risk insurance, and then the proceeds will be in such a way that should there be any political risk occurrence, then the claims, the payments from the insurance will actually be first going to the debt holders, okay, because the debt holders will need to be protected first. But the question is, should the equity investors also go for political insurance? So, there are many arguments. For example, should equity investors use insurance at all is a bigger question. See, first of all, equity is basically investors who actually assume all the residual risk, and therefore it also reflected in the share price. So, the equity investors should not actually go for any insurance is one thought. The second thought is that equity holders should actually be assuming the business risk, and they should not be hiding behind the safety of an insurance policy, and if they feel that the risk is unacceptable, they should simply not be making the investment at all, rather than making the investment and then seeking the insurance risk. So, that is the second argument. But then we are talking about not any kinds of risk, we are talking about specifically political risk, which is not in the control of the equity holders, but is a much broader risk that can even affect the equity investors. So, what are the problems in equity investors actually taking in political risk? So, normally whenever there is an insurance claim that is being paid, the insurance firm also has a claim over the underlying assets. Let us say, for example, in the case of the housing insurance that we talked about, when the insurance policy pays and the insurance claim is being made on the insurance company, after the claims has been paid, then the insurance company would actually have a right for the underlying asset. Okay. Now, if we actually assume the same principle for the equity investors as well, if the equity investors go for a political risk insurance and if they actually claim a political risk insurance, then the insurance company would actually have right for the underlying assets, which is in this case is the equity shareholding. Right. By going in for an insurance policy, the equity holders are liable for assigning their rights as equity shareholders to the insurance company should there be any political risk occurrence. Now, what is the problem in that? The problem in that is usually lenders also ask security of the equity as a security for lending to the project company. Right. So, whenever there is political insurance and the project is defaulted, then the lenders would actually use the equity as an asset to recover part of their payments. Now, at the same time, if the equity investors also claim political risk insurance, and if the insurance company actually claims the underlying equity as an asset for settling the payments, then it is going to be very difficult because the equity has already been assigned to the lenders as security, and the equity holders do not have any claim on the equity because it has been assigned and the lenders have used the underlying equity as security because the project has defaulted. So, these issues has to be resolved before the equity holders actually claim or start taking political insurance. So, the second question that we have is, can we actually develop a general framework for risk management based on the various contracting and insurance tools that we have seen so far? So, remember we talked about various types of risk, but then the tools of risk management that we talked about are broadly two categories. Okay. So, we talked about risk management tools as largely under two categories. Right. We talked about contracts and we talked about insurance. Right. So, now we will have to really understand when do we actually go for contracts and when do we actually go for insurance. So, my question is to try and see, can we actually develop some kind of a general framework whereby we can decide these are the risks that can be contracted and these are the risks that we need to be insured. Okay. So, I am going to suggest a general framework. Let us say we look at classifying the project risk in a broadly 2 by 2 matrix. On the one side of the matrix, on the x axis we actually map the risk based on our ability to control. Right. So, when you are talking about ability to control, it is not the ability to control from a lender's perspective or ability to control from the shareholder's perspective. It is about the ability to control the risk by anyone who is going to be associated with the project. Right. So, on the y axis you actually have the two types of risk that we talked about. We talked about the project specific risk and we talked about the market risk. Okay. Now, within this categories of risk, how can we actually map the different risk factors based on the ability to control? Okay. So, on the quadrant on the left hand side under the project specific risk you have force majeure risk. Right. So, force majeure risk are actually what is known as acts of God. It can be fire, it can be floods, it can be due to man-made events like terrorism and so on. So, these are some things that is going to be very difficult for anybody to predict or for anybody to control. These are all uncertain, unpredictable. So, therefore, the ability to control these events from occurrence is very low. So, that is why I have actually classified it as in the quadrant in the leftmost quadrant. And then we talk about there are some risks, let us say for example the operator performance, right, how efficiently the project is being operated, how efficiently the turbine operates and so on. And then we talk about risk related to issuance of permits, how soon are we able to obtain the permits, is the government delaying issuance of permits, and cost overrun and delay, right, is the project going to be implemented on time, is the project going to be implemented on budget. So, this is another risk. If it actually exceeds, if there is an overrun, this can actually affect the project. And then you have competition, right, are there going to be competing facilities that are going to be constructed, are there going to be competing power plants that are going to come up. So, these are some of the things. Then we also talk about support features, let us say for example for the project to be constructed, now we need to actually have supporting facilities, electricity supply, water connections and so on. So, these are the supporting facilities, and then there are various environmental risks that needs to be managed. So, if you really look at these kinds of risk categories, this can be easily controlled. Okay. Let me give an example. Let us talk about cost overrun and delay. So, cost overrun and delay to a certain extent can be controlled by the EPC contractor. Okay. So, it may not be possible to be controlled by, let us say, the debtor or the shareholder, but EPC contractor will be in a better position to control the cost overrun. So, similarly we talked about land acquisition and permits. Okay. Who actually issues the land acquisition permit? It is the government that actually issues the land acquisition and permits. So, therefore, government is in a better position to control the risk of providing permits. Okay. So, we actually map ability to control is very high. It may not be possible by the debtors or the equity shareholders, but someone else can actually control some of these events. Now, let us look at some of the risk factors that are in the market, right. So, in the leftmost quadrant we actually have some risks where it becomes difficult to control, right. Can we actually control the demand? Let us say we are talking about demand for power. Demand for power depends on so many other factors in the economy, right. Can we actually control it? It is going to be very difficult, right. Then there are a couple of other indicators, let us say the inflation. Is it possible to really have any control on what is going to be the inflation? Okay. So, that is also going to be difficult. So, therefore, these are all risk factors which we have very limited ability to control. Right. Similarly, we are talking about exchange rate risk, we are talking about interest rate risks, difficult to control from a project perspective, particularly in an open market economy. This all becomes very difficult risk to control. On the other hand, we have certain risks like force majeure political risk. Let us say the project is having expropriation, or there are some things like currency convertibility, and so those are all risks that can actually be controlled. It may not be controlled by the shareholders, but it is actually under the control of the government. Okay. So, we actually have different categories of risk which we can classify in terms of the ability to control. Now, after having decided the classification based on the ability to control, we kind of see how we are going to manage this risk. Okay. So, those risks where we have a very limited ability to control, we normally go for insurance. Okay. Let us say for example, floods, fire, earthquakes, terrorism, very limited ability to control. So, the general guideline is we will go for insurance, and those risks which we have a very high ability to control, then we allocate in terms of contracts. Okay. So, what is this allocation? We actually sign a contract and then transfer the risk to the person who is best able to manage that risk. Let us say for example, if you want to manage cost overrun and time overrun, we actually sign a contract with the EPC contractor, right. So, that is allocating the risk of cost overrun, time overrun to the EPC contractor. Similarly, when we talked about permits, we actually sign a government support agreement which will ensure that the government is able to provide the permits in a faster manner. So, that is again we are trying to allocate the risk to the government. Right. So, we are trying to allocate risk by in terms of signing contracts. Contracts is nothing but allocating risk to that party which is in a best position to manage those risks. And if you actually have some risks which can either be insured or which can either be contracted out, we will try and ensure that it is actually influenced in a way which is most effective. Let us say for example, if you are able to provide insurance for a particular kind of risk, but the insurance is very expensive, can we actually influence it in such a way that so that it can be allocated to a particular counterparty. So, in which case can we actually contract it out if it is cheaper. So, there are some risks which we need to kind of influence this way or the other depending on which is most cost effective. Similarly, if you look at the market risk, there are some risks which actually have very low ability to control, which will have to be borne by the project. So, for example, the demand risk, then we talked about risks of inflation and all of these things, it has to be borne by the project. You may actually come back and say that some of it can actually be contracted out. Let us say when you actually have a power purchase agreement, the power purchase agreement actually removes the risk of demand. And if the power purchase agreement is also indexed to inflation, that also removes the inflation risk. Yes, it is possible to contract out some of this risk, but then when you are actually trying to contract out, we are actually compromising on the returns. A project where all the risks are completely contracted out or allocated might actually not be making so much of returns, because the cost of contracting is also very high, right, and that needs to be borne in mind. Similarly, if you look at other risks like exchange rate risk, you are looking at interest rate risk, you can actually contract out. For example, you can actually have a swap contract, or you can actually have forward contract to manage your exchange and interest rate risks. And there are couple of other insurance, couple of other contract kind of actions that we can use to manage the market specific risk. Let us say for example, you have political risk, that we can actually use a political risk insurance, right. So, we are also trying to use, if it is not really possible to actually contract out, let us say insurance is used as secondary level of protection. Political risk can actually be allocated by a government support agreement. But if the government is not in a position to honor the obligations, then over and above the government support agreement, we need political insurance. Okay, so that is what we are talking about. And sometimes we can also try and deter political risk by, let us say, using multilateral, bilateral agency lending, or we have export credit agencies which will kind of discourage political risk that we are actually looking at, and the quadrant in market risks where we have a very high ability to control. So, these are some of the generic risk management strategies that we should be aware of. Okay. But there are some general principles of risk management that we will discuss. One is when you talk about risk allocation, we should allocate risk to the party that controls the risk or has the greatest impact on its occurrence. So, try and allocate risk who is to that party which is in a better position to manage them. So, if you are talking about issuing of permits, it can be addressed by the government support agreement. If we are talking about cost overruns, that can be addressed by the EPC contract. If you are talking about operation and maintenance, that can be addressed by the O&M agreement. So, in each of these cases, we are allocating it to that party who is better position to manage those risks. If we are talking about fuel supply, then we are trying to actually have a fuel supply agreement and thereby allocating the risk to the fuel supplier, right. Second, we also need to understand that contracts work best when the risks are identifiable. That is, when you are trying to define the provisions of the contract, we should be in a position to define under what circumstances will the terms of the contract hold, right. What are the circumstances that should be excluded from the contract. So, the risk factor should be identifiable, right. We are not saying that there is no risk at all, but the risk should be clearly identified, and the outcomes are verifiable, right. Can we actually measure the outcomes? Let us say for example, can you actually measure the performance of the plant? It could be in terms of amount of power generated, or it could be in terms of the time for which it is available, and so on and so forth. And then the contract should be in a position to be enforced. Let us say if there is a dispute, or if one party is not able to honor the terms of the contract, then we should actually have a legal recourse so that the contracts can be enforced. The third is we have to allocate risk to that party that can bear them at the least cost. Let us say you have multiple alternatives in terms of managing a particular risk, but then we will have to allocate, we will have to do contract it to that party which will be able to where it will be able to bear them at the lowest possible cost. So, that will ensure that the entire project costs are kept to the minimum, right. And then finally, we have to allocate the residual risk and the return to align incentives and induce optimal behavior. So, basically we are talking about structuring incentives to induce optimal behavior between the investors. So, we are talking about risk that let us say broadly it can be classified as two types. One is your downside risk and the other is your upside risk. Okay, downside risk is if that event happens, if downside risk is basically if there is non occurrence of a particular event, then it can actually affect the project investors. If there is a delay in completion of the project, then it actually affects the project investors. Okay. What is the upside risk? Upside risk is if that event actually occurs, then it can actually provide some kind of benefits to the investors, right. So, if there is an increase in price, it can actually lead to an increase in revenues and it can lead to an increase in profits. So, that is your upside risk. Okay. So, the general rule is the debt holder should actually bear the downside risk. So, if the project is not being able to be completed on time, if the project is there is a cost escalation, then the risk actually have to be borne by the debt holders. On the other hand, now any upside will have to be borne by the equity investors. Why? Because any gains from the upside will actually go to the equity holders, and therefore, they should also be willing to assume this risk. If there is any increase in tariffs, if there is any increase in traffic, who is actually going to get the maximum gain out of this? So, it is the equity holders who will act to get the maximum. So, any risk related to this upside will have to be borne by the equity holders. So, now let us look at the topic today's topic, which essentially is trying to understand the context of infrastructure development. Despite the fact that this course is largely oriented towards private sector infrastructure development, we need to be clear that public sector is going to play a major role in terms of developing infrastructure. In fact, for the foreseeable future, we are going to see significant amount of public sector involvement in terms of infrastructure development. Okay. So that is a context. So, why is it important for us to really understand public sector infrastructure development? Because it is only an effective public sector that can actually attract private sector involvement. So, if you are really talking about two large operating models in the economy, one is a public sector model and the other is a private sector model, and for the private sector model to thrive, the public sector model also have to be healthy. The public sector model will also have to be vibrant. If you actually have a weaker public sector model and we are talking about private sector involvement, then it is not going to work at all. So, the entire infrastructure should be functioning in a very robust and sustainable manner, and therefore, it is also important therefore to understand how we can actually improve the efficiency of public sector infrastructure. So, essentially we talk about successful providers of infrastructure have to have three basic characteristics. One is there has to be very clear and coherent goals, right. What should be the mandate, what should be the objectives of the infrastructure provider. So, that should be very clear. Is it actually going to be providing facilities to the large number of people? Is it actually going to be providing access at the lowest cost? Is it going to be able to provide access at very high levels of service quality? Is it going to be providing access at the lowest price? So, whatever it is, right, there has to be very clear and coherent goals to the infrastructure provider. Second is the management should be autonomous and the employees are made accountable. So, when I say autonomous, there has to be very limited interference from the government, right. The government can set very broad policy directions, but in terms of day to day operations it should be left to the management, right. government should not dictate which of the employees should be recruited, government should not be in a position of interfering and they say what kind of offices should be opened. So, these are all decisions that has to be left to the management. And 3, employees should be made accountable for their actions and results. Okay. In a public sector framework, in the governmental framework, employees do not have a very high degree of accountability as compared to what we see in the private sector. Okay. So, if we really need to have infrastructure operating on a commercial basis, the employee should be made accountable. And finally, the third factor is financial independence. If the organization is ever relying on the government finance and budgetary allocations, then it may not be able to take right decisions. So, therefore, the institution, the organization should be as much as possible financially independent, and these are the 3 broad features that we actually see in good commercial organizations. What are the problems with public sector infrastructure enterprises? Okay. So, if we really look at government really has multiple objectives. Some of the objectives could be social, some of the objectives could be economy, and some of the objectives could be political. And when you are talking about infrastructure enterprises being run by the government or being part of the public sector, then the multiple objectives of the government also get spilled over to the in the infrastructure sector. Right. Today we are talking about, let us say, free provision to agriculture. Right. So, that is can be looked at it from a social or that can be looked at it from a political perspective. Now, if this objective of the government is to provide low cost power or power at no cost to the agriculture, then this objective then gets transferred to the state electricity board. Then state electricity board starts providing free power to the agriculturists. Right. So, there is the objective of the government which gets spilled over to the public sector enterprises. Second is there are restrictions in establishing accountability and rewarding good performance. So, most of the time really look at public sector employees, there is no initiative to really put in good performance because they simply feel that they are not getting rewarded, right, enough as compared to a person who is not performing very well. Right. So, if performance is not rewarded and if poor performers get the same level of pay as a person who is actually performing very well, then there is no incentive for the performer who is actually doing very well. Okay. So, rewarding good performance is a challenge and is not so much practiced in the public sector. Establishing accountability, who is responsible for any failures, who is responsible for good performance. So, if you are able to establish that accountability, then the incentives can be aligned as well. And the financial status of public agencies depend on budgetary decision making. Right. So, the government budgets play an important role in terms of how much fund is allocated to various public agencies involved in infrastructure development, and this allocation is not based on any performance. Right. If the performance is very good, then they actually get higher level of budgetary amounts. That kind of practice does not really exist. So, it is more ad hoc and it is more suited to some of the broader objectives of the government. And many times the pricing decisions are driven by politics. So, I was actually talking about free power to the agriculturists. In fact, supplying power to the agriculturists is actually going to take a lot more cost as compared to supplying power to urban areas, simply because of the fact that agriculture land is so vast and widespread and they are very far away from main load centers, and therefore, a lot of support infrastructure is needed. You need to invest a lot in transmission infrastructure to actually carry power to the agriculturists. Right. So, but the pricing decision does not reflect the cost that it takes to supply power to the agriculture segment. Why? Because this is a pricing decision that is driven for into a certain extent by political reasons. Okay. And then we have wage and labor problems. There is substantially more labor in a public sector as compared to the private sector, simply because in many cases public sector the government uses the public sector organizations as a way to provide employment to some of the sections of the society. So, the important thing now is to see how we can actually enforce commercial operations in the public sector. That is, we talked about some of the shortcomings and the ills faced by the public sector, and if you have to really make the strengthen the public sector, then we will have to make them commercially oriented. We will have to ensure that they operate on a commercial basis. Okay. While the immediate objective would be to strengthen, make the operations commercially viable, the long term objective is that one day if the operations are commercially viable, we will be able to get any kind of private sector involvement at the later stage. Right. So, what are the broad strategies that have been used to make the operations commercially viable? Right. One is to go in the process of corporatization, and then we talked about focused goals and making management accountable, and within that we have different strategies. For example, you have performance agreements, you have management contracts, and then you have service contracts, and then the third strategy is to actually have a pricing strategy that ensures cost recovery and provides financial independence. Okay. So, we will look at each of them in some detail. The first is corporatization. Okay. So, what is corporatization? Corporatization is to actually separate infrastructure service providers from the government. Right. When we started off initially, infrastructure service provision was actually part of the government as a part of a government department. Right. But today we are talking about they being set up as independent organizations, and they are being set up as independent corporations. So, they may be public sector organizations, but today they function not as government departments, but actually they function as independent companies. Okay. So, can you think of a government department that is involved in an infrastructure sector? Right. So, the foremost example is Indian Railways. So, Indian Railways is a part of the government. It is not actually a separate organization, it is a separate corporate that provides infrastructure services. Right. On the other hand, we can have several examples where the government department actually transformed to a corporate structure. Right. The most common example that is quoted is the Department of Telephones. Today, after liberalization, the telecommunication services in the public sector is provided by BSNL, which is Bharat Sanchar Nigam Limited. So, earlier telecom was a part of government, it was under the Department of Telecommunication. Right. So, what was once part of the government is now being corporatized. Today, we have a corporate structure that actually provides telecommunication services. If you really look at other forms of transportation, let us say today you have the public sector aircraft carrier, which is Air India. So, Air India is not part of the government, but is actually a separate corporate entity. So, you have several such entities that are operating on a separate corporate structure. You have National Hydropower Corporation, you have National Thermal Power Corporation. Though these are all public sector entities, they are operating on a corporate format. So, one step to make government infrastructure providers to make commercially viable is to make them as corporate entities. So, we have seen several examples where before privatization governments make them as corporate entities. One more example that I can name is in the case of Orissa. So, Orissa, we actually had a lot of power facilities under the Department of Energy, Government of Orissa. Right. And when power sector reform was being implemented, all of these assets was transferred to a separate company called the Orissa Power Generation Corporation, OPGC. Right. So, that is a process of corporatization. Right. Before OPGC was could be privatized, we actually look at corporatization as an intermediate step which will facilitate subsequent privatization. So, what does it mean? What does corporatization result in? Right? Corporatization gives enterprise an independent status. It is not really a part of the government. There is essentially going to be an arm's length distance in any transaction between the government and the corporate entity. So, though government still owns a majority of the corporate entity, it is still not the government. Okay. and it also means that the entity will be subject to standard laws and is less susceptible to government interference. So, when you actually set it up as a corporate structure, then you are applicable to the company's law under which you actually set up the entity, right. So, that means the standard commercial laws, tax laws that are applicable to the corporate structure is also applicable to the new corporatized entity. Okay. And because of the fact that there is some level of separation, it is also expected that the level of government interference is going to be limited after the corporatization. Another benefit of corporatization is in terms of following commercial accounting procedures, and this is actually going to bring in a lot more transparency in terms of identifying what are the large costs, and are we doing enough to be able to and it is going to, by shedding information, by throwing light on large cost structures, it will give us information in terms of how we can actually control this cost. Okay. So, the next tool to make organizations commercially viable is to have what is called as focused goals and accountable management. So, how do we do that? There are broadly three ways in which it is done. One is to actually have performance targets, okay, where the employees and the management of the entity clearly know what is it that they are going to be measured upon, and and how are they going to be rewarded, what are the incentives for achieving certain levels of performance, and so on and so forth. So, when you are talking about following a performance agreement method, what actually happen is we retain all the decisions in the public sector, right, except that there is nothing that is being outsourced to the private sector, except that the way in which performance is measured, it is a lot more transparent, it is a lot more objective, and there is more focus in terms of performance and achieving performance. And for that to happen, there has to be substantial development of information technology, whereby we have different levels of information systems like management information systems and executive information systems and decision support systems and so on. So, a lot of investment needs to be made in information technology and and processes, and we also needs to have evaluation systems for performance monitoring. So, we need to develop all of this before we can actually structure a performance agreement. So, if you are actually looking at accountability, accountability should also result in some kind of autonomy, right. So, we cannot insist on accountability without giving sufficient managerial autonomy. So, there will be a consequent increase in managerial autonomy for the enterprise, and if the agreed upon performance targets has been fulfilled, then there will be rewards for workers and managers as well. So, it is both performance and pay. So, talking about bringing what is called as pay for performance culture in the public sector. Okay. So, having this performance based management helps to build incentives and also to monitor the incentives in the public sector regime, and so that is an important step in making the organization to be commercially viable. The second is to actually go in for what is known as management contracting. Okay. So, in the management contracting, largely the employees of the existing entity remain with the public sector, but then you bring in key people from the private sector, right, and the private sector will then be responsible for the operations, and it will also scope for the broader responsibility for the entity. Right. And we saw this kind of an example in the case of Orissa power sector reform as well, where we actually had a management contract, and we had key people from BSES. They actually came and oversaw the transformation of the corporatization process in the case of Orissa power sector reform. Right. But there are some difficulties in doing this management contracting as well, because a public sector entity has a lot of compulsions and restrictions on how they can actually function. Right. And when you actually have management from the private sector responsible for the operations, and having a responsibility for major decisions such as productivity and quality, it is going to be very difficult for them to function under the existing constraints without much of flexibility and so on. Right. So, under many instances, management contracting has led to a failure simply because the private sector management has not been able to perform as they would like because of the constraints of the public sector management. But there are instances where they have been successful as well, and the instances where they have been successful also dependent on the kind of incentives that was given in management contracting. For example, you are talking about contracting, you can pay fees on two categories. One is there is a fixed fee irrespective of performance. So, the managers from the private sector will be paid a fixed fee for the amount of time that they are involved with the organization, right. Or the second is you actually pay fee based on performance, that is if you are able to achieve certain level of performance, then you actually get a higher fee. So, the incentive then is aligned for both the private sector and the public sector. The private sector gets compensated more if they are able to achieve more success, and rather than being paid a fixed fee where there is enough incentive for the private sector to actually work as hard as possible. But generally it is felt that management contracting is not a long term solution, but it is more useful as interim arrangements where both the private sector and the public sector try and learn to understand each other and try and gain from the partnership experience. So, the next example in terms of making a public sector commercially viable is called as service contracting, and where we actually take out specific components and then have the private sector participate in those activities. And generally the advantage of this is considered to be it's flexible and cost effective for increasing productivity and for making it more responsive to users. Okay. And another advantage is that it taps expertise too expensive to maintain permanently on public payrolls. Let us say for example, there is a large data center that is being set up by the public sector, and then there has to be some kind of expertise needed to maintain the thing, but then for maintaining that you do not need somebody full time, but you need somebody who is having a lot of experience in doing it. In case if the public sector wants to do the maintenance on its own, it will have to hire somebody, but then the talent might not be needed full time. But if it is actually been outsourced, if the entire maintenance has been outsourced as a service contract, then it is possible to access this expertise, but at the same time you do not have to have them full time on the public roles and then pay them salary for the entire time that they are going to be involved. Right. So, we see this kinds of service contracting in so many places. Let us say for example, today if you look at in railways, the catering service in railways today is been contracted to private service providers, right. It is no longer the employees of Indian Railways who are doing the catering and other services in trains. Another example is let us say in the case of the Indian Airlines or Air India. The Air India runs what is called as the frequent flyer program to reward flyers who frequently use Air India. And now the entire program of frequent flyer program has been outsourced. So, that is a service that is actually provided to some flyers, and Air India has actually contracted out the entire service provision to a private operator. Right. So, you have several such service contracts. In many cases the state electricity boards have actually outsourced the billing activity. Right. Some of them have outsourced the collection activity. Right. So, these are all specific service contracts that we have been able to incorporate in the public sector framework to make it to make the entire process a lot more effective. And what is more, the service contracting need not be there for the entire organization, it can be for a specific geographical or zonal region as well. And when you are actually trying to contract out for a particular region, you will also be able to get competition across multiple providers, right. So, there is some kind of benchmark between different providers providing the same kind of service in different regions. Generally it has been used for maintenance services, but as I was giving you some examples, we are trying to see in other areas as well. Okay. So, service contracting is being increasingly used to increase the commercial orientation of public sector enterprises. And finally, we are talking about the pricing strategy. For the organization to be commercially oriented, you need to actually have reliable revenue streams, and when you have reliable revenue streams, that also gives the providers more autonomy. Okay, they are able to take decisions independently. So today in India we have what is called as public sector enterprises. So public sector enterprises that are profitable, they have a lot more financial autonomy as compared to organizations that are not so profitable, right. So we have Navratnas. So some of the organizations are called Navratnas, large organizations that are actually very profitable. They have a lot more autonomy. The government has given them a lot more autonomy as compared to organizations which still rely on the government for financial support, right. So commercial operations results in a lot of financial autonomy for the organizations, right. It reduces budgetary transfers, and by reducing the reliance on the government, it is also in a position to ward off interference from the government, right. It reduces the interference from the government. How do we actually achieve let us say financial autonomy? One is you can actually cut down costs. So basically you can cut down cost and achieve productive efficiency, right. Let us say in the case of water supply, how do we actually cut down costs? We can probably enhance metering so that people are actually paying for the amount of water that they actually consume. So meter is one strategy where you are able to cut costs. Then we can also recover costs by pricing it appropriately, right. For example, if you need to create adequate capacity to meet the peak demand, and if it actually costs more for maintaining that additional capacity, then the pricing should be done in such a way that the cost can be recovered, right. Then the third category is we are talking about cost recovery on the poor. So sorry, we started late, about 15 minutes late, because the room was closed, so I will take 5 more minutes.
I don't know. You can check your watch. I am supposed to have a class here for 10 a large group of students.
So you have to tell me, and that is why I told before itself to tell you that they started late.
Okay.
Sorry?
Sorry, close it.
No, it is not closed, because I need 5 more minutes, and they started 15 minutes late because the room was locked.
Okay. So it will have a chain effect.
Yeah, it will have. I told them to inform you so that you are aware of it.
No, it's not a question of informing me. I'm not informing me. It's a question of students have another class after this. Please continue. You are losing time.
Yeah.
Please continue.
Okay, then we are talking about the cost recovery on the poor. There is many times an argument being made that the poor will not be able to actually be able to pay for the services, and therefore the services have to be subsidized for the poor. So that is one argument. Sometimes it has actually been felt that if there is no adequate services to the poor, and then the poor are then forced to actually procure services from external sources like other private providers, which can be very expensive, right. So the issue here is not in terms of subsidizing for the poor, because if you are actually subsidizing for the poor, then does not give enough revenues, and then the organization is then consistently dependent on on budgetary support, right. And if the budgetary support is not adequate, then the poor cannot get enough access, and if there is no enough access, then they are actually going to be relying on the private suppliers, which can actually be very expensive. So therefore we need to be actually devising a system whereby the organization is not continuously reliant on the budgetary support, and therefore we will have to have what is called as a very predictable and transparent process, where we know so much is going to come from revenues, and we know we have so much is going to come from budgetary allocations, right. So, and this long term strategy is actually going to be to ensure that pricing is done in such a way that it is able to meet most of the costs, but then where there has to be some kind of social objective involved, then it has to be done through budgetary transfers, but the processes will have to be transparent in both the cases. So, before we end the lecture, we have a couple of thought questions. The first question is, what is an important ingredient necessary for commercial functioning of public sector enterprises? And the second question is, in addition to commercial functioning, what other elements are considered necessary for successful functioning of the infrastructure sector? Right? So, we will try and spend some time to discuss these questions in the next few lectures. Thank you.